I would like to thank and acknowledge the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research for his support and for providing the Distinguished Visiting Scholar scheme that has enabled us to welcome and hear Professor Mulcahy this evening, as well as fund several other such events over the coming years. If you wish to find out more about our planned future events involving Professor Mulcahy, please keep looking at the UTS Architecture blog. I'd also like to make a particular welcome to our symposium delegates who are here today for the Architecture, Law and Census Symposium, of which this is the keynote lecture. Many of you have travelled a great distance to be here today, so we'd really like to acknowledge that and thank you for being here. It's my great privilege to be able to introduce UTS Distinguished Visiting Scholar Professor Mulcahy to you this evening. Professor Mulcahy joined the Law Department at the London School of Economics and Political Science in 2010, and prior to this has held positions at the Universities of Bristol, Oxford, London, South Bank and the Law Commission. She's currently the Director of the LSE Doctoral Training Centre, as well as the doctoral program within the Law Department. Professor Mulcahy is a former chair of the UK Socio-Legal Studies Association, an editor of Socio and Legal Studies, and has recently been elected as an academician.
I can't say it either.
Okay, good.
Fellow, apparently.
All right, Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in recognition of her contribution to UK social sciences. She has written and edited some 11 books, 20 articles in peer-reviewed journals, and over 20 book chapters. Professor Mulcahy's work is strongly interdisciplinary and sits between the interface of law, sociology, and the history of art and architecture. Her considerable expertise spans the varied topics of medico-legal disputes, contract law, mediation, the socio-legal dynamics of disputes, legal oral histories, and more recently, courthouse design. Professor Mulcahy's monograph, Legal Architecture, Justice, Due Process and the Place of Law, published by Routledge in 2011, broke new ground in the emerging legal and architectural discourse around the design of law courts and the geopolitics of legal proceedings. Reviewed in the Feminist Legal Studies, LaRue claims Professor Mulcahy does for the history of the modern courtroom what Foucault did earlier for the history of the prison and the clinic. The book charts an alternative history of the trial, focusing on an analysis of the history of ideas around the architecture of the courthouse, from the containment of the jury, the increasing amount of space allocated to advocates, the incarceration of the criminal defendant in the dock, the containment of spectators, and the creation of dedicated space for journalism. Professor Mulcahy depicts their complex histories in order to reveal the way the courthouse can be seen as complicit in empowering or disempowering justice participants. Since the publication of her monograph, Professor Mulcahy's work has extended to other facets of the intersection between architecture, design, art, and the law. During the Architecture, Law and the Census Symposium tomorrow, she will be turning her attention to the world of street art, where she will challenge where the law has, to date, been able to adequately engage with this form of material culture. She is currently in receipt of 2 research grants from the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council. One project in partnership with the British Library is funding an oral history of court clerks. Another, in conjunction with Professor Les Moran from the University of London, whom we are also pleased to welcome with us here today, is exploring the ways judicial images are produced, managed and consumed. And I have the privilege to work with Professor Mulcahy on the recently awarded Leverhulme Trust grant, which is funding our research into the modern history of courthouse design in the UK. Judging from the wealth of experience on this topic that Professor Mulcahy brings, I'm certain that we will all leave today's lecture with a new perspective on our justice environments and a fresh questioning of who really are today's form makers. So would you join me to give Professor Mulcahy a very warm welcome?
That's always the worst bit, isn't it? I'm glad we've got that over and done with now. Thanks, Mum. I would also like to start with a thank you to UTS for inviting me over as a visiting professor here and for funding my visit. I suspect there are some colleagues in the School of Architecture that are wondering how the hell they got a law professor appointed to be one of their visiting scholars. And I'm sort of hoping that by the end of tonight's lecture it'll all be okay, that I've convinced you that I'm a particular type of lawyer and probably not the sort that you're most worried about. I think. And what I'd really like to do in the lecture tonight is to explore the potential for new types of interdisciplinary research in law and architecture. To consider, in particular, what the two disciplines can learn from each other. Some of you might argue that the interface between law and architecture is already pretty clear. Okay, there are lots of scholars who already worked at that interface. A simple search on Google, for instance, where we all start, obviously, reveals multiple references to 3 areas where we find that architects and lawyers are already talking to each other. So the most frequent hit that we get is reference to contractual disputes, okay, and dispute resolution between builders, electricians, surveyors, architects. And I know that area well. I teach contract law and I teach dispute resolution, and we always hold up that field as being one of the areas, the construction industry as being a prime example of multi-layered dispute resolution procedures, for instance. The second group of hits that you get would be a set of references to the way in which law protects architects through protecting their intellectual property in their designs. And then finally, we will find multiple references to planning law and the way in which law constrains design. And in some sense, then, all of these topics can be conceptualized as a sort of law of the architecture of architecture, if you like. They indicate what law permits architects to do and how it constrains them. Law is a regulatory force. One of the questions that I want to pose in this lecture, with all due respect to people working in those fields, is that as good as it gets? Is that as much as we can do when we're trying to think about the relationship between law and architecture? As a community of intellectuals, are these the only connections we can see between our disciplines, our methodological orientations, our contemporary concerns? Is there not more to be explored about the ways in which both architecture and law facilitate concepts and experiences of exclusion and inclusion? The ways in which they combine in the creation of habitats in public spaces, the way in which they mark and legitimate the allocation and protection of territory, and perhaps most importantly, the way in which both disciplines actualize the enjoyment and, in fact, the reification of private property rights. So isn't there more research in law and architecture that goes beyond property disputes, intellectual property, or planning issues? And if so, why haven't we found that there has been more work at this interface? Is it a result of intellectual isolationalism, which means that both our disciplines have traditionally had quite strong links with professional bodies? And I think that within the academy, we probably both found it relatively easy to turn our faces to the profession at certain times in our history, rather than turn our faces to other scholars within the academy. And I don't want to make assumptions about architecture, but certainly within the UK, there's a really good literature on the isolationist tendencies of law schools and the way in which they have done that and turned their back. And it's something that sociolegal scholars and critical scholars will see as part of their own history of trying to change that way of doing things. So it could be that we both have links with practitioners and professionals, and it's been easy for us to turn our faces that way rather than to other disciplines. Or it could be that there's something a little bit more fundamental at stake about our inability to see more crossover at an intellectual or theoretical level between our disciplines. I wonder if it's because of the focus of one discipline on the visual and the other discipline on the word, for instance. In a legal context, critical scholars such as Cornelia Weissman have drawn attention to the many ways in which the capacity of art and architecture to evoke emotion stands in especially strong contrast to modern law's claim to reason and rationality. So while the visual has largely been assigned by our society to the realms of imagination, creativity, playfulness, law, by contrast, has increasingly been assigned to control, discipline, and sobriety, so that our methodological orientations remain fundamentally different. I find that thesis attractive, and it's been influential in some of my existing work. But I'm also troubled by the fact that law is also intensely visual, that this is an incomplete account of law's relationship with the visual. Rituals surrounding the opening of the legal year, which Les has been working on, the staging of the trial and court dress, all speak to a need to harness the power of the visual and place in the legitimation of law and legal process. It seems to me that visual culture and the built environment have long played a strategic role in supporting and legitimising dominant power structures and have been used unashamedly as the handmaidens of political and legal elites. And for this reason, Costas Desinas has suggested that it's probably more accurate, whilst recognising the different methodological orientations of the two disciplines, to suggest that elites over time have developed conventions about what constitutes acceptable representations of law, which have resulted in an economy of permitted representations. And it's trying to delve down and look a little bit more at that economy of permitted representations that I'd like to focus on tonight. I'm conscious that I have already raised too many issues to deal with in a relatively short lecture, and I'd like to think that we can continue to have a discussion about the potential for new research agendas in architecture and law. But what I want to turn to specifically tonight is a case study of how lawyers and architects might work more closely together in unravelling how economies of permitted representations of law in the built environment have emerged, how they've been sustained, and how they have gained legitimacy over time. And I'd like to do this by reference to the history of ideas about courthouse design. Now, as some of you will know, I published a book on this subject, which Emma referred to, which attempted to chart shifting ideas of how participants in the trial have been placed and contained from the medieval period to the current day in England. It wasn't meant to be a 700-year history, but as always with research projects, you think if I just went back a bit further, I could understand what I'm really looking at a little bit more closely. So it ended up in this sort of overly ambitious 700-year history, I'm afraid. And I'm not going to bore you with the story of the book tonight, because I know a number of you have seen me giving presentations on it. But I did want to reference it by way to explaining that one of the things that that book does is carves out 3 key evolutionary points in the history of ideas about court design, from the old age tradition of holding courts in multi-purpose building spaces, which we did for many hundreds of years. But since that has become unfashionable, there are really sort of 3 stages, I think, that have occurred. And it's one of those stages, which I didn't cover very well in my book, that I'd like to return to tonight, because it's the focus of a new project that I'm running with Emma. So the first of these evolutions away from the multi-purpose public building, the pub, the concert hall. Courts were held all over the place under trees until 1867 in one state in America. The first of these then was the emergence of a discrete building type, which is the first building that we call a courthouse. There was no such thing as a house devoted only to courts prior to that period, and that begins in the latter part of the 18th century. When trials moved from being held in multi-purpose buildings to separate buildings, which featured really prominently in the civic and cityscapes of the Victorian era. The second of the shifts, the major shifts I think that occurs, is then in the 1980s in the UK, where we see for the first time the centralisation of control over courthouse design. We see the emergence of a centralised court design guide. And the launch, in the wake of that, of the largest UK court building programme ever. Actually, some people say the largest public building programme we have ever had in the UK was that court building programme of that period. The third of these evolutions is occurring now, as increasing use is made of video link and remote witness testimony in the trial. And academic commentators have begun to talk about the dematerialisation of the courthouse and the challenges that that poses. I think Emma's coined a much more accurate phrase when she talks about dispersed courthouses, because we're not actually getting rid of the buildings, we're just, people are in different buildings while the trial is going on. So as regards the first of those themes and the final one, I think I've pretty much had my say on what I think about those. I can't generate any new ideas about those, so I'm going to move on and accept my limitations. And as some of my friends know, it was bad enough doing the emergence of the discrete courthouse, because I got lost in the 19th century for about 2 years and just didn't seem to be able to leave it. But it's the second of the themes that I mentioned, the emergence of a centralised court design guide, which I really wanted to focus on tonight, because it continues to fascinate me, and I don't think I gave it justice in my book. And Emma and I have been fortunate enough to get a Leverhulme Trust grant recently to pursue this particular project over a 2-year period. And I'd say that research pretty much started today, where we finally started to burrow down and some material that we happened to gather when we were in London 2 years ago. And what that research will do is look at the emergence of design templates and the ways in which these have influenced or grown in parallel to the emergence of modern conventions in other jurisdictions, most notably Australia. Okay, so the first question that I always expect people to ask me about my research is why bother? And it seems to me that it's important to say that this project is more of a history of the recent past that could be seen as defunct, as new ideas about architecture and legal practice have changed. Because the significance of debates about court design in the 1970s and the 1980s, when they became centralised, is that they signal the point at which I would claim that court design became fossilised in the UK. And that's its significance, because that fossilisation continues to have an impact on what we think we're capable of doing with court design. And there's one quotation that I keep on coming back to that bothers me. And it's a quotation from the UK Court Standards and Design Guide, the Centralised Design Guide, and it has its origins in debates in the 1970s and has been included in the Court Design Guide since the 1991 version was published. And it asserts, if you can't follow me the first time, don't worry, I'm going to keep on coming back to this quotation because I'm obsessed with it. And it says, "The courtroom layouts are the results of careful consideration by numerous user groups. They incorporate specific and well-defined relationships between the various participants by means of carefully arranged sightlines, distances, and levels. It has been found that attempts by individual designers to improve on these layouts have rarely been successful, and consequently, these layouts are to be adopted in all cases." So I'm glad there's a little bit of a rumour which suggests that other people are as bothered by that quotation as I am. That quotation troubles me because it suggests that courtrooms have authentic, fixed, unproblematic identities in which the placing of bodies in particular ways is no longer contestable. Is it really the case that the internal design of the courtroom has reached such a peak of perfection? The quotation troubles me because the impact of this statement is to deny the possibility of further debate about design and due process that I suspect the progressive lawyers and architects in this room would like to have. It troubles me most because a central thesis to emerge from my last book was that as English society moved towards democracy, court design actually became progressively less and less democratic. So let me quickly expand on that idea by reference to two important illustrations, because it's, I hope, a controversial thesis that the courtrooms have become increasingly undemocratic. Okay, a number of you have heard me talk on court design, have seen this reference, these pictures before. These are the Wadden manuscripts. In England, they are the oldest surviving pictures of courtrooms. And if any of you are in England, please go to the Temple and see them, because you can see the manuscripts in their original state and you don't even have to wear white gloves. They're that casual about them in the Inns of Court. They are beautiful. They are so much more beautiful in reality than you can ever portray in a picture of them. These were produced in the 15th century. As I say, they're the longest surviving image of a trial in England, so a fantastic source for scholars. And I'm going to show you two tonight. They're 4 illuminations of the King's Courts at Westminster. And clearly, for those of us interested in due process, they're not without their problems. The alert amongst you will have seen that some of the defendants waiting for trial are actually in a cage, okay, in the vicinity of the court, which is clearly an issue. If we look to the representation of the King's Bench, we see that the defendants waiting for trial are manacled and they're dishevelled, which suggests that they've been kept in pretty similar conditions to the people in the cage that we saw in the last picture. So I'm not saying that these images are without their problems, but I think that there are two features of this court that are particularly worthy of attention and bring us, I think, right up to the 21st century. The first of them is that the defendant, who has a blue coat, has his lawyer to his left as you look at him. So this is a court, a medieval court, in which defendants stand shoulder to shoulder with their counsel. That is a privilege that defendants in neither the UK or Australia enjoy today. In fact, we are increasingly producing a different sort of cage from the one in the Court of Exchequer that I've just shown you. It's a glass cage, a glass box within the courtroom. So the defendant now sits in a box or in a room within a courtroom. You've got to love the Daily Mail, haven't you, for their illustrations. I just love how aggressive those co-defendants look at in the top one. But it conveys, I think, quite an important message, which is why I include it, which is this whole problem about the presumption of innocence when you put somebody in a glass cage in a box. Okay, so secondly then, I think a second thing that's particularly worthy of note in the Wadden manuscript is that the medieval court illustrated there is what Claire Graham has called a sociable court, in which spectators move freely. I'll just flick you back. You can't see it so clearly in that one. But illustrations that come shortly after these were produced demonstrate how people are moving freely. And I've got some couple of pictures from later centuries. So these are courts in which spectators move freely around the courtrooms. Observers not directly involved in legal proceedings watch the trial, often from three sides in the courtroom. And illustrations from across centuries such as these suggest that freedom to move about freely in the vicinity of proceedings was enjoyed for some time in England, I would say until the latter part of the 18th century. But even after that, when the spectators began to be placed in specific spaces in the courtroom, in public galleries, to the back or to the side, they continued to come to watch trials. And Victorians and early 20th century courts could commonly contain up to 200 spectators. And I know that because I go to historic courts and I count the number of spaces that there are in the public gallery by doing little crab steps along. So right up until the end of the 19th century, we see quite large spectators' galleries. The current court design guide, developed from the 90s and onwards, specifies that in a standard Crown Court, there should be 25 places set aside for spectators at the back of the courtroom. As a lawyer, this suggests to me that design templates for the interior of English courts have not reached the state of perfection by reference to the ideals that are fundamental to notions of natural justice and due process, such as the presumption of innocence, the right to consult counsel, and the importance of trials being held in public. But I'd like to pause here for just a minute to make what I hope is an important methodological point which directly pertains to my choice of title and the questions posed at the beginning of this lecture. If we return to the bigger theme of how academic lawyers, architects, and art historians should be encouraged to forge new collaborative projects, it's vital, I think, to stress that the evidence for these two arguments I have made about the defendant's positioning and the sociable court, the loss of certain freedoms, those are stories that cannot be found in legal texts. They haven't been found in legal texts. They're not stories that you'll find in official transcripts of trials or reports that occur in the media. They are not stories that you will find in academic or practitioner-orientated journals, which tend to discuss the significance of what was said in court. These stories, instead, about the gradual disenfranchisement of lay participants in the trial have been tracked through architectural plans, through visits to buildings that house courts, and a content analysis of many decades of illustrations of trials in popular Victorian, Edwardian newspapers and periodicals. Indeed, one of the few academic articles on the spatial construction of spectator identities in the trial was written by Lynn Need, who's an art historian. I consider it a failure of contemporary legal scholarship that we've not paid more attention to the spatial dynamics of the trial or the phenomenology of the trial. In contrast to what are generally constructed by lawyers as stories of the progressive acquisition of rights in histories of the common law, which is a common tendency that lawyers talk about having a few skirmishes about due process rights, but really there's been a progressive acquisition of rights as we've gone through the centuries. These sources, I would argue, these sources alone at times tell the story of how lawyers have been placed in front of their clients with their backs to them, how defendants have been contained in rooms within rooms, and the public have gradually been discouraged from attending the trials. And so I hope that the point is made that these are some of the things that I believe that architecture and art history have the potential to tell law about itself. So using these using these what I hope are some insights, honestly, sorry, it's an intelligence test. I will get used to this in the end and remember which way it goes. What Emma and I are now trying to do is to interrogate that quotation again, which claims that attempts by individual designers to improve on contemporary layouts have rarely been successful, and consequently these layouts are to be adopted in all cases. And what we're intending to explore is what attempts were made to improve on the existing templates, these attempts that are referred to, the criteria that were used to determine whether or not these attempts had been successful or not, who was responsible for determining these criteria, and the extent to which lawyers and architects were involved in negotiations about them. In short, then, what were the conditions of possibility that rendered this quotation legitimate in the eyes of the Ministry of Justice? Our express intention is to challenge the assumptions made by the Ministry of Justice and to engender discussion about alternative design models. If we achieve nothing else, I hope our goal will be achieved to initiate debates about the design principles that should govern the conditions in which the 250,000 defendants who face criminal charges in the UK criminal courts every year, could and should be tried. More explicitly, we're attempting to ignite debate about the relationship between due process, participatory democracy, and architecture, by exploring the extent to which the design of criminal courthouse facilitates participation in and scrutiny of the modern justice system, by interrogating the success of government departments in imagining and commissioning courtrooms which reflect the frequently competing goals of security, accessibility, transparency, mystery, authority, and legibility, by evaluating the justifications for such shifts, and to ask whether a change in the policy agenda is now called for. So in the remainder of this lecture, what I'd like to do is to review some of the themes that are emerging in this history of the recent past and to invite comment on them. So until the 1980s, funding of buildings for the assize was largely the responsibility of the county in which courts were held. And this resulted in a really rich variety of styles and facilities across the country, and courthouses that clearly expressed their links with the local community in the use of bas-reliefs and sculpture which reflected sources of power, local fame, wealth. And this system lasted for over 700 years. By the 1960s, those arrangements for the county deciding on how and what they would build were being questioned as outdated and inefficient. And this provided policymakers and designers with an opportunity to promote the merits of centralised planning. 2 world wars, a depression, and a focus on the provision of new domestic housing had all contributed to the lack of attention to justice facilities within government and design community. In the meantime, the post-war rise in crime put an additional strain on justice facilities which were already deemed inadequate by modern needs. When the Beeching Commission, those of you who know anything about English politics will know that Beeching was also known for the dissemination of the railways in Britain. That's how he's normally remembered. He was also appointed as a hatchet man for a commission set up in 1966 to inquire into the system of assize and quarter sessions I've been describing. And by the time it sat, it received really numerous submissions about the state of courthouses across the country, which provided a lot of detailed evidence of the failure of existing buildings to meet the needs of a modern litigation system. So this was a really important policy moment in which it seems to me that the accident of a dilapidated building stock caused by 2 world wars and a housing crisis, combined with the Labour government's ambition for big government in the UK to create a space in which it was considered credible to argue for fundamental change in the design of courthouses. I've been fortunate enough to track down the civil servant who served as the secretary of the Beeching Committee and saw through the reforms. And my abiding memory of talking, I've done about 6 hours of interviews with him now, is that he just keeps on talking about statistics and rationalisation. And that was the language that seemed to dominate the whole policy environment in which the Beeching Commission was deciding what to do with these courts of quarter session and assize. What happened as a result is that a new type of court was created in the UK, a Crown Court. We abolished a 700-year system of having assizes. And these Crown Courts were actually placed in new metropolises in the UK, those that were large rather than those that had a historical importance or significance. And the committee also recommended a thorough review of the estate and the centralisation of responsibility for court design. So most importantly for present purposes, the responsibility for court design moved away from local committees based at county level to a Ministry of Justice, then called the Lord Chancellor's Department. The thirst for rationalisation, which was so characteristic of this era, had a really important offshoot for court design then, which was the birth of what we think is the first centralised planning guide for courts in the UK. And the US quickly followed the UK. Other countries haven't so much, and perhaps we'll come back to Australia towards the end, which hasn't followed that pattern. The French, bless them, have just produced a 12-page court planning guide, which you can imagine is all about the meaning of the court rather than, I think, the air conditioning systems and the size of the doors. So yet to translate that one, but we're looking forward to it. Okay, so we're told about this production of this court design guide that civil servants, architects and the judiciary were encouraged for the first time to translate their collective experience and presumptions about court architecture into a universal template to guide all courthouse designers. And that the production of that guide was a deliberate attempt to provide a standardised and rational base for the rapid compilation of briefs, which gave a clear understanding of the design issues to be addressed. So the significance then was the challenge that the possibility of this guide provided for policymakers and designers to reconsider how a late 20th century courthouse in a democratic society should look and be experienced. Inactivity in the first half of the 20th century in terms of building courthouses meant that by the time these expectations came to be reviewed, there'd been seismic shifts in the political and social context in which these debates took place. So when Beeching sat, what he had to look at was a stock of Victorian and Georgian courthouses. And so much had changed since then that this really was quite a special moment. The introduction of universal suffrage, post-war alterations in the social contract heralded the birth of an era in which public institutions, including the legal system, were expected to be more accountable to the general public than ever before. And early guides reflect a strong sense of the heritage of the legal system and the ways in which architecture had been used to glorify law in the past. But while Victorian ambition continued to inspire architects of the period, there is also a clear recognition that the messages the courthouses the Victorians produced was that the institution of law should not be questioned. There was, for instance, a recognition that courthouses of the past had rarely reflected concern for the comfort of the public, or been concerned with images of justice as accessible. And commentators have suggested that a strong sense emerged of the need for a new approach to design, which reflected the fact that sovereignty was increasingly being seen as vested in the people. I want you to hang on to these moments because it gets grim, okay, when we see what actually happens, but it's a beautiful rhetoric. And in the words of Brown, who chaired some of those early committees looking into centralised court design, he said the challenge for court designers was the resolution of the dialogue between the individual and the state, the rulers and the ruled, and a building which symbolises the health and viability of such a social contract. So debates about what can be labelled the democratic turn in courthouse design were really highly visible in the field of architecture during this period. The opportunities for experimental design, which broke with traditions of the past, were particularly rife. And we see the simple, undecorated lines, geometrical forms, and attention to function of modernist design, providing a stark contrast with the neoclassical or Gothic forms that I've shown you previously that they were deliberately drawing on ideas of rupture with the past here. Importantly, concerns about overcrowding and inadequate segregation of participants in the new Crown Courts, which had inherited the assize estate, led to an extensive new building programme for courts, which lasted from 1972 until 1996. It cost $500 million, and centralisation of responsibility for the building stock created the opportunity then to translate those principles people were talking about in the Court Design Guide as it emerged into new build. And 139 projects were completed during this 24-year period. And such was the importance of this new building programme that Paul Rock has referred to it as one of the largest programmes of monumental buildings since the pyramids, seen by some as the last major contribution by central government to Britain's city centres. So courthouses built during this era were strongly influenced by modernist and postmodernist ideas about design. At an international level, buildings such as Corbusier's courts at Chandigarh, where the majesty of law is represented by massive concrete pylons, proved revolutionary in their subversion of traditional design concepts. In an Australian context, Courtstein also names the building of the High Court in Canberra, with its use of high ceilings and flat courtrooms, as the moment when judicial buildings in Australia attained their contemporary voice. In a UK context, I think our achievements were probably more modest than that, but there were clearly genuine efforts to achieve an appearance of lightness and dignity as a foil to the oppressive mass and solidarity of Victorian courts with which people were familiar. Courts of this era can also be characterised, I think, by much less pretentious interiors, which consciously resisted those conventional trappings and superficial trappings of pomp and civic dignity. Courtrooms became noticeably simpler and flatter. There was much less evidence of hierarchy reflected in the vertical dimensions of the room, and a conscious rejection of the sort of excessive detailing loved by Victorian architects, what architects came to call the wedding cake courts of the type on the left, because they were so tiered throughout. And that with their central well, their theatre-like qualities, were rejected during this period in favour of courtrooms in which additional height was only used for the judicial dais and the back row of jurors. Now, here's my favourite court from this period, Boulton Crown Court. Genuinely my favourite because I think it's the most honest court in the UK. It really makes clear to people what's going to happen when they go in. It's going to be horrible. So until we get our criminal justice system sorted out, I think that's a really fabulous, honest court. But there is no question when you look at some of the much hallowed assumptions about how the relationship with state and individual should be symbolised in built form, that there was questioning going on during this period of how we should represent law. But controversies inevitably arose in that early stage. For many critics, the new build brought with it excessive utilitarian tendencies, which in some cases could be read as brutal rather than humane. Critics were worried about the modernist penchant for simplicity of design, which was often read as austere. Reflecting on the period, Hannock, who was at the Department of Constitutional Affairs, concluded that the new breed of courtrooms were designed as if they were clinical operating theatres, with the aim of excluding all external noise, and that lighting was mercilessly efficient. Lots of strip lighting, you can imagine what was going on. Such buildings also conveyed what another architect, government architect, has since described as crushing bureaucracy on court design. So the success of the architects of the era in breaking with tradition is clear. Their success in creating buildings which were accessible or inviting, possibly less so. So there was a response on the part of those who were involved in the centralised planning guide to these criticisms of these early experiments in court design. And what we find after this first tranche of courts is that subsequent design guides begin to emphasise explicitly that machine-type qualities were considered inappropriate design templates for courts and were best understood as a product of a particular architectural era. Another reaction that we see to these problems identified in the courts was the adoption of a much more prescriptive approach to design principles which should steer new build. So while those early design guides left the architects with a little bit more discretion, we suddenly find the court design guides getting much more prescriptive. In a section which has appeared in design guides since the 1990s, it's made explicitly clear that law courts should suggest openness. I love this rhetoric. The majesty of the law is a phrase often used as guidance to the designer, but there are many ways of interpreting this abstract concept. That the function of a courthouse is fundamentally serious is not to be disregarded, but it must also be remembered that for most people, attendance in the building will be a rare and perhaps disturbing experience. This consideration should temper the designer's approach. The building should be seen less as a symbol of authority than as an expression of the concept of justice and equality before the law. The scales of justice are a more appropriate symbol than the sword of retribution. Okay. More ambitiously, the guide begins to suggest that modern build should delight and excite the senses whilst stretching the imagination. So why does that quotation about existing templates not being capable of improvement that I keep on coming back to continue to bother me, when I can feel safe that the government has the interest of delight and majesty, accessibility and equality at heart? Well, there are so many reasons. I'm really nervous about saying this in front of an audience that contains architects. But even since the 1990s, even since the end of that first phase of design where some of the brutalism of those early courts was criticised, the standard of building has generally been dispiriting and disappointing in the UK, if only through the use of the materials. Architectural successes are seen by some commentators as the exception rather than the norm, including Reba, with most schemes being described as bland and nondescript. Critics have expressed particular concern that the introduction of the public-private finance initiative, which has since been abandoned, for new courthouses in 1996, has brought down standards of design, and that the consequent emphasis on a profit-driven ethos has been seen as endangering aesthetic considerations and undermining the notion that public buildings are civic projects which stand for something greater than functional necessity. And in fact, one way to interpret the fact that the design guide has now grown to a massive 960 pages is to see it as a way of pinning down building firms that are now being contracted to build courts under the public-private, or were contracted to build courts under the public-private finance initiative, to make sure that there was a minimum quality in terms of the provision of materials. It also remains worthy of note that while many of the courthouses of the late 18th and 19th century were built by leading architects of the day, this has not been the case since. Ironically, British architects are designing important courthouses all over the world, but not in the UK. The Richard Rogers Partnership was responsible for the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. I was telling one of your colleagues last night over dinner how I realised when I went to the European Court with a bunch of architects that are even bitchier than lawyers, because they just went around saying that screw doesn't need to be there, that pane of glass. So it was a great experience going with architects to that building. Richard Rogers, I think more successfully, has also recently built the courts in Bordeaux, known by the locals as the Englishman's Revenge. I think they're rather special. I could wax lyrical about that particular court for a while. Richard Rogers has also designed a very beautiful court, which has terrible courtrooms, but the courthouse is very beautiful in Antwerp. Norman Foster and Partners have designed the Supreme Court in Singapore. They're now in the process of overseeing the construction of the High Courts of Justice and Supreme Court in Madrid. And David Chipperfield completed the City of Justice in Italy, which has just recently been completed. So, one of the things that these beautiful exterior designs remind me is that we have a problem in modern court design in the UK, possibly internationally, with attractive wrappers. Now, Courtstein referred to the wrapper. She's there. I thought it might be a technical architectural term. Emma says she doesn't think it is, but I love this notion of the problem of the wrapper. Because one of the other things that concerns me about the Modern Court Design Guide is that if you look closely at it, it demonstrates that the goals of accessibility and equality are much more frequently discussed in that design guide in relation to the exterior of courts than they are the interior. Most obvious is the fact that while centralised planning appears to encourage flatter courtrooms, the practice of segregating and fortifying the internal space of the modern courthouse has continued in ways which I believe remain unacceptable in a modern and civilised justice system. And whilst Australia did not follow suit in adopting a centralised design guide, and while it is undoubtedly producing much more beautiful and thoughtful exteriors to courts than we are in the UK, architects in Australia appear to me to be equally as wedded as English architects to the conventional templates for courtrooms, which they are not contesting. Whether convincing architecturally or not, these facades that I've been showing you of these beautiful buildings present, in the manner of theatrical tradition, masks which permeate the themes of severity, officialdom, tragedy, neutrality, the benign and the paternalistic. The importance of architectural creativity is recognised by our court design guide, but it's largely limited to the facade and the entrance hall. As regards the courtroom, the design guide makes it clear that the expectation is that architects will design courts with an eye to tradition and prescribed order. This suggests that despite some shifts in modern design templates, practice as regards the courthouse, the modern courtroom, in which the dock has moved from being a simple rail or waist-height wooden structure in the 19th century and early 20th to an increasingly fortified room within a room in the 21st, and that the public are discussed in the context of the danger they pose to the safety of others. We have screens between the public gallery and the dock for fear that the public will harm the defendant. And this is a common way to talk about the public in the court design. There's no glorification of the public rendering the trial dignified and legitimate by reason of being there. There's no beautiful rhetoric about the public trial there. The public is seen as a nuisance and a danger. There's a lovely bit in the court design guide which talks about needing to move people through the courthouse as you do an airport, because if you let them linger in a space for long enough, they'll just put graffiti on the wall. It's a wonderful characterisation of what the public want to do when they go to courthouse. So within the courtroom, defendants continue to be placed in those glass docks at the margins of the court. The general public in our mature democracy continue to be placed at the sides of the courts with limited sight lines. Their sight lines are restricted. And lawyers continue to sit with their backs to their clients. So 700 years after the publication of the Wadden manuscripts, the contemporary design of courtrooms in the UK and Australia suggests that the laity are less able to participate in proceedings than their medieval counterparts. So how could this have happened? Where are all the radical architects working to subvert these conventions? Okay, when I started this project, I very naively thought that the architects whose work I would be looking at would be bravely speaking to power. And Emma very quickly put me right. They'll be speaking to the client, Linda, not to power. I've become more sympathetic to that view. Bernard Schumi has been telling us for years that architects, the role of the architect is to project on the ground the dominant images of social institutions rather than to challenge them. And I'm sympathetic to jobbing architects and the way in which they are constrained. So let me turn my rancour then to lawyers. Where are all the radical lawyers who are worried that the use of the fortified dock militates against the presumption of innocence, or the defendant's right to counsel, that restricted sightlines imposed on spectators allow us to challenge that the trial is not genuinely open to the public? These are concerns, these stories I've been telling you about the dock, that you won't find in human rights or civil rights literature, and that fascinates me. There are occasional skirmishes about the presence of the dock. In the Bembrica 12 trials, Justice Bongiorno ordered for a glass dock, which had glass partitions separating out the defendants, to be taken down, a brave move. You talk to him about it, he just thinks it's part of the inherent jurisdiction that he had in the court to determine how it would be laid out, and he just thought it was militated against due process rights. But it's a one-off, it's not part of a judicial campaign against the dock. In the UK, the Thompson and Venables case, which went to the European Court of Human Rights, is one of the few cases in the European Court's jurisprudence that acknowledges that architecture can contribute to the violation of the right to a fair trial. In that case, because the court manager had raised the dock because it was two children being tried, he thought they would be better able to see the proceedings. What it meant was that they were just a few feet away from angry crowds in the public gallery, and as a result of that, they feared for their life. So it was seen as contributing, but even then it was only seen as a contributing factor amongst many. The cages used in Italian and Russian courts have been the subject of criticism of the European Court, but the standard glass dock, of which I have shown you pictures tonight, has been specifically insulated from criticism in one case. Perhaps it's easier to criticise your own discipline, but I do continue to be dismayed at the way that legal practitioners and academics are not more alert to the dissonance between the rhetoric of human rights and the reality of the courtroom experience. But the access that Emma and I are gaining to government minutes, government internal memos and reports on the emergence of a centralised design guide and the thinking behind it, I think also begin to make us a little bit more sensitive to the role of the lawyer and the architect, because effectively they have been excluded from that process. We see very few situations in which lawyers are consulted about the court design guide. There is one moment in the early 1990s, we're calling the Teddington experiment, where there was some more widespread consultation. But lawyers are not routinely put on the court design guide working party that oversees the evolution of the court design guide over time. Private architects are not routinely put on that. There is no one there to represent architecture, societies, institutions. And in fact, in a document that we were looking at today, which I found really interesting, architects were actually referred to as lay designers. As a category, they were referred to as lay designers because it was the civil servants on the committee that knew how to design a court. I thought that was quite fascinating. What we are finding is that it's security advisors, with all their paraphernalia of secrecy, obsession, and rigidity of attitude, that have been transformed effectively into the modern-day form makers of the court design guide. Some commentators have suggested that security needs have increased tenfold in the last 3 decades, and certainly courthouses are being placed further from the street. They have low walls around them, and we are placing at-risk categories of users deep inside the building. People have drawn attention to the danger that bureaucrats are tending to favour solutions which make buildings look severe as a way of conveying messages to those inclined to breach security. Initial images and experiences of the courthouse associated with having one's possessions and body searched in airport-style security machines also prove problematic in terms of the impression, the first impression they give of people of what the courthouse is about and what will happen there. And it seems to me that if courthouses are to become so fortified that judges and jurors are sequestered within their walls, then the ultimate cost of security may begin to outweigh its benefits. Given the lack of people speaking out on behalf of keeping public spaces accessible, it's argued that the time is surely right for a conversation about the balance between openness, fearlessness, and security. There are undoubtedly a small number of trials in which security measures are justified, but I do remain upset when I go to magistrates' court and somebody is being tried for a petty shopping offence or benefit fraud and they are placed in a glass dock because that has become the norm. And I find that to happen so much more frequently than you would expect. Clearly, lawyers can ask in certain cases for their client to come and sit with them. In a UK setting, that seems to me to be really rarely happening. So these security concerns about the few are affecting the experience of the many. So what I wanted to end on very quickly were just a couple of words about whether there's light at the end of the tunnel, because I'm worried that I'm producing a sort of rather gloomy picture. I think there are wonderful courthouses being built around the world. We have the architect, some of those here with us. A number of them have been built in Australia. I would, for instance, rate the Commonwealth Law Courts in Melbourne as being one of my favourite courthouses, the Collingwood Justice Centre as being about one of the most thoughtfully designed interiors of a courthouse. There are also courts in which architects are deliberately subverting convention. Richard Rogers' courthouse in Antwerp is a very good example in which the internal corridors used by judges, generally hidden away behind a wall, have actually been constructed in glass, so that the public in a reverse panopticon can watch the judges as they go about their business. Judges hated that on the tour. But I think that much of what I've spoken about tonight reflects a malaise which is common in what Colin Crouch has labelled the post-democratic society. There's no doubt that the UK and Australia function with fully operating and formally democratic systems. Elections are held, governments fall, there's freedom of speech. But the enjoyment of key rights associated with democracy and the rule of law are also, I think, being progressively limited. Research has suggested that defendants concentrate in their own trials for less than an hour, often bored or confused by what Pat Carlin has labelled the theatrical autism of the courtroom. My own research suggests that public galleries are practically empty in all but the most sensational of trials. And judges in both the UK and Australia have readily embraced new video technologies which allow evidence to be beamed into them in the court, but object routinely to the televising of trials which allow their images to be beamed out. All problematic. But can we do anything about it? Of course we can. In fact, academics are in a much better position to imagine different futures than anyone else, especially jobbing lawyers and jobbing architects. We can revisit educational programmes in which we focus on the wrappings at the expense of the interior in architecture schools. We can revisit human rights discourse by shifting from formal rights to a better understanding of the phenomenology of the trial. We can work together to conceive of new ways of thinking about participatory justice, unhampered by procedural rules or the limitation of a design brief in the way that our practitioner colleagues are. So, I think this is what we should do. I think we should start pairing up architecture students with law students. I think we should start organising charrette studios competitions. I think we should start changing the conditions of possibility that constrain detailed exploration of the links between design and due process. Thank you. I think there's time for questions. Is there, Anne?
Would anyone like to ask a question? Thank you, Linda. Sure.
We don't need that. I need it for the audience. Can you hear me?
We are videoing, so...
Thank you. And I'm a little concerned about my talk tomorrow on the Supreme Court in New Zealand. Because now I'm full of holes, I think. No, but do you see parallels between the post-democratisation in courthouses and other civic architecture? Council chambers, that sort of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's time for questions. Is there, Anne?
I need it for the audience. Can you hear me?
We are videoing, so...
I need it for the audience. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
It seems to me it's striking parallels. between
yeah,
the two.
I'm an empiricist, so I like to burrow down deep, and it will take me for ages to make all those links, but absolutely. I mean, I've told some of my friends here tonight this story already, but I stopped off in Rockhampton on the way down. I flew to Cairns and we drove down. I don't know whether anyone knows Rockhampton. It's absolutely impossible to find the civic centre. Your first impression is just sign pollution as you go through all these out of town shopping centres. We had deliberately booked a hotel in the central business district because we were only there for one night, wanted to see the centre. We couldn't find the centre. We could find a Victorian post house, we could find a Victorian town hall, and we could find some rather grand hotels. But none of them were functioning in that capacity anymore. And then when we asked at reception, they sort of looked at us as if we were a little bit stupid and said, the shopping mall's just down the road. And it's sort of, it said a lot. I really worry about where we're positioning law courts. Now, the Court Design Guide actually says that they should be in prominent places, but Hazel Gahan in the UK has recently written a beautiful Hamlin lecture a couple of years ago when she talks about the number of county courts that are actually over shops. So, yeah, I really worry about that. I think it is part of a much bigger trend. It's sort of unfashionable, isn't it, to say you want to reclaim the law court for the cityscape. And I think that's partly because we have lost our faith in law, that certainly in the UK we're subsumed by rhetoric around hyperlexis, too much litigation, get cases, the vanishing trial. Oh, good. I'm glad to hear it.
At the moment is raising the ire of many a commercial developer who would like car parking rather than precinct.
It's so ironic because in the Victorian era, it was the people in commerce who were funding the building of courthouse in the UK through private subscription. Because, we were reforming the legal system in the Victorian era, and they were the people that benefited from it. Those second-generational industrialists, and they wanted the courthouse. They wanted it to symbol the new middle-class power. So it's such a turnaround.
Thank you, Linda. That was a wonderful presentation. I was just wondering if your research with Emma, you're looking at the beloved virtual courts at all, and the access to those, which I found incredibly difficult.
Yeah, we're not. I think because Emma and I have both written a little bit on the virtual courts already, especially Emma. But I think what's really important about this current project is that one of Emma's concerns, certainly, about the virtual court or video technology is that planners are often blindly following templates that were established in the 70s and 80s and trying to reproduce something that is like the real thing. And we're saying the real thing isn't great, so please don't go and reproduce it. So I think is that fair, Emma? I think towards the end of the book, there will be a reference to how what we're saying should influence thinking about the virtual trial and video evidence. Yeah.
Thanks, Linda. Maybe I'm going to be controversial. My question is, has there ever been a democratic moment? And the reason for me posing the question is that I'm familiar with the idea of the multifunctional space in the pre-modern era, under the tree, etc., where people could drift in and out. The walls were temporary, the space was open, as you showed in some of the diagrams, to the post-democratic image of the courtroom. But I'm suspicious about the sort of the filling in between. So, the images that you have from 19th century journals were probably images about the most sensational trials. So, the recent scandal about telephone hacking in the media saw the Old Bailey courtroom packed with people. You had to queue up to get in there and couldn't get in because it was so oversubscribed. Whereas the sort of ordinary everyday magistrate's court, probably for all time, has been largely empty. you briefly mentioned, the 19th century explosion of temples of justice, and as you rightly say, these were paid for by the bourgeois or the emerging bourgeois individuals, and I know the message that they were sending out through those temples of justice was one of fear and awe. And it wasn't to bring the working classes in to observe, because I think for all time they were seen as unruly. So even though democracy may have been spread out slowly from the mid-19th century, that was not about bringing people into the courtroom to participate in justice.
Yeah.
Now, so I'm just wondering if there's a different story to be told, and in a sense, you're putting on the agenda the democratic moment, which I think is a very radical agenda. But I wonder if it fits into a rather different story than the one that you're telling.
No, I mean, there are really great questions, Les. I mean, there are lots of stories to be told, and in an hour, I've had to sort of inevitably simplify, and some of those themes I hope I deal with in my book. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, why would you believe there'd ever been a democratic moment where there'd been a beneficent king who had administered justice under the tree? It's the same old power, isn't it, if you're a Marxist? So, no, I don't think there has ever been a democratic moment. But I would just say that, and I think your point about the representation of trials is absolutely right, that probably those were sensational trials, although, I've spent quite a lot of time reading through the County Court Chronicle, and those weren't exciting trials. And there is a lot of talk about control of the public. There are a lot of people in that public arena. So I don't know, because I'm really troubled by the methodology I've been adopting about how we know what part the public have played in the trial over time. Looking at those Victorian and Edwardian journals is the closest I have got to there being a representation of the public, because they don't get talked about unless they're in contempt of court. They don't get talked about in legal transcripts or reports of trial. Times I've searched through all the time since the first issue to find references to the public in trials. You don't find them. So it seems to me that these visual images are something for us to go on, but I absolutely, I'm troubled. I think I had the conversation with you last night, Emma, about what I can say from that, given that people have always gone to sensational trials, they continue to. But I'm just going to sort of suggest one reason that brings me back to thinking that might be a story to be told there. First of all, the Wadden manuscripts. Okay, I do think it is really striking, despite the fact that we knew those defendants were being held in cages and dungeons or whatever, that they could stand shoulder to shoulder with their counsel, because I do think that is a fundamental. We talk about the right to counsel. How can you enjoy that right to counsel when you have a glass screen in front of you, and in order to attract the attention of your barrister, you have to attract the attention of your solicitor, which you can only do by telling the dock officer. And we find that there are fewer and fewer dock officers, because they don't need dock officers, because they've put somebody in a prison in the courtroom. And there are little slats, for those of you who aren't familiar with modern courthouses, there are often slats between the glass which goes up to the ceiling. And the idea is that you're supposed to be able to put a note through that slat. It's often the judge that tells the lawyers that their client wants to attract their attention, but you can put a note through that. Emma and I have gone through today the discussion around the abolition of small tables in the dock and paper and pens that allows defendants to write those notes, because the Home Office was incredibly dismissive in what was such a patronising paragraph that we found, that most defendants aren't going to be interested in writing. So I do think you look at Wadden and you look at the modern court design guide, I think there is something going on there. I'm not saying there was a democratic moment in Wadden. It was a medieval era. Those were the king's courts. I'm not that naive. But I think there are things that were assumed there. I also think it's interesting that in those noisy, sociable, early Victorian courts, people were shouting out, they were smelly, noisy. There were prostitutes in the courts. They were selling things. I think there's something about people feeling that they participated, and I suspect the other thing I would say is if you go back and walk those courts, the public galleries are big. And that indicates to me that even in the smaller courts, even some of the courts I've seen on the Welsh border that are small courts, you still get a significant public gallery. Now, people will say, yeah, but in the 20th century, everyone started watching television or going to the cinema, which I think shows a tremendous ignorance of all the new forms of entertainment in the Victorian era. that's when we see the evolution of all these new forms of entertainment. So I think it's a really complex story. I'm not sure I've got there yet, but I'm going to hold on to the fact that public galleries were much bigger, and I'm going to hold on to the fact that courts were more sociable and people did feel they were participating, and that that's what I'm going to hold on to.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yes.
Because there's also an incredible history of the legal proceedings, executions being public moments, and I wonder, and they were designed to instruct the public so that the rabble knew how to behave, and I wonder if that isn't part of the story, that you had people attending trials because this was a form of public theater and instruction. And that's not so much the case, perhaps, now in the 21st century, because we watch television or we look on the internet, or I wondered if that instruction has shifted to another form of public entertainment, if you will.
Yeah, I have another paper that I've written from a very feminist perspective about that issue, actually. I slightly worry that 19th century historians talk about the trial as a form of entertainment, as though people couldn't also be execution, couldn't also be seriously interested in how law worked. And there's particularly, they talk about, when it becomes socially unacceptable for people to start going along to those executions, it's women they hit first. It's unwomanly for somebody to do that. And it sort of seems to me to deny women quite an important role in the public sphere. So I always object to that notion of entertainment, but I think it's an important point. And I think what's really interesting is in Foucault's Spectacle of the Scaffold, he leaves us with this research project that I always feel needs to be done. He says, what he's talking about is what happened in France, that justice goes behind doors. But he says in the adversarial trial in England, they continue to have the spectacle. And I think there's a nice little sort of comparative study to be done there. But I suppose that's the very issue that we're interested in. You might have other forms of entertainment, you might have the internet, but long before that, and it begins in the Victorian era actually, the segmentation of the courtroom into different zones. But what we see in this period in the 70s is the complete closing down of the creation of a space, whereas a member of the public, you could come in and think, it's okay for me to be here. I'm just going to tell a very quick story before the next question, so forgive me for this, but it's a funny story. Emma and I went to a conference in Lincoln on law and architecture a couple of years ago, and Emma had a family friend there who's a High Court judge, I don't know, in Melbourne? Anyway, he's a High Court judge, and he was very politely saying to me on the way, we went to see a court together, and he said, Linda, I really liked your article. It was my first article on law and architecture. Emma gave it to me to read. I thought it was a really fine academic article. So I was all puffed up, thinking how important I was. We went in halfway through a trial, and we couldn't find where to sit. And we're really confused. The room wasn't legible at all, but we got ushered towards the back of the court, and Emma and I got out our books and started sort of making notes. And the court usher came over to us and told us to stop writing, that we were not to write, that they had a very important High Court judge up from London, and they didn't want us writing in the court. Now, Emma and I sort of accepted that, because when you're a researcher, you just exist into the conditions that people allow you to a lot of the time, so we sort of just thought, okay. But this judge friend of Emma's was beside himself with anger and started challenging the usher and saying, by what authority do you do this? And on the way out of the court, he said to me, I have to be honest, I thought your paper was rubbish. I thought you were completely overdoing how difficult it is to be a spectator in a court. And now I understand what you're saying. He said, yes. Yeah, I've won one practitioner over. But it was quite striking, I think, seeing how his experience changed when he had to get out from behind the bench and realised how difficult it is to be a spectator. So it's what you do in design terms to make it difficult. What are the conditions you produce that make people think, this is not where I belong? You go into a lot of English courts and they'll ask you, it's like a wedding, bride or groom, they'll say defendant or prosecution, which always I love. And you say, oh, neither. And then they say, are you the duty solicitor? You go, no. Are you the probation officer? They want to know who you are, because it's unusual to have someone they can't instantly identify. All those things seem to speak to me to sort of particular habitus that's been created. I think that's what we're trying to chart in part. But it's a great comment.
Do you think, just quickly on that, on your note and on your note, do you think that there's been a shift away from inviting public, trial by public, so the humiliation aspect of being judged by your peers who are not in the jury box, and that has led to a discouragement of the public coming along for the spectacle of the trial. Because I know I was intrigued when I was in the Cook Islands last year that they still have a full page in the local press of people charged with offences and when they will appear in court and where and the time, and quite in depth about what. And to me, that resonates with a society that still has a very strong name and shame aspect to their justice system, unofficial, which we in New Zealand certainly don't have anymore. We don't publish that kind of information in papers. We do online though, and it's an unofficial way, and there's certain things going on in New Zealand at the moment about that. But do you think that that might explain a public or an official quietening of the invitation to come to court?
Except, I suppose what I would say is, I don't go to the courts to contribute to the shaming of the defendant. I appreciate that some people may do that. I go to the court, and this is what I get from the rule of law literature. I go to the court to make sure the judge is doing their job properly. And I think that's what's lost from that formula. But I think certainly we do so much through proxies now that the press, one of the things I was interested in my book was the way in which the press become proxies for the public. And in fact, even today when we were looking at that literature, you find out, well, where do we place the press? Do we place them at the front of the public gallery, or do we give them their own place? Concern about, these are proxies for the public. And I think the jury become a proxy for all of us. And interestingly, as we all know, the jury used to sit with the public around the court, and then there was a point in which they got sequestered off because the public was seen as a danger to the jury. That's also quite interesting. So it's just that those shifting ideas that fascinate me, how we could go from one idea that's so fundamentally different about the jury being of the people and sitting with them to one where we think the public are a danger to the jury. So I think we just, in some ways, and it is rhetoric rather than reality, Les, I think we need to pull back some of that rhetoric that has been important to us as lawyers. I go to the trial to make sure the judge does their job. And for that reason, when I'm at the Old Bailey, as I was once, and I couldn't see the video screen on which evidence was being presented, and I thought my job was to actually have access to all the same evidence as everyone else, so I could make up my mind whether the judge had done a good job. And this is the way that Lindsay Farmer talks about the notion of participatory justice. It's not just that you're there, you participate through assessing how well the judge has done their job. And I was told, that I must sit down and not make a fuss because I couldn't see the video screen. That concerns me. So I think we have to reclaim some of that sort of rhetoric about publicity in law, really, rather than seeing it as being terribly shameful to be in the public gallery, because it means either you're a relative of a crook or you're going there to shame them. I think there are other things that we should be thinking about.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I found it really interesting, and particularly I think how you characterise the relationship between architect and the client. Seems the client sees the architect more as technician, less as collaborator in the context that you're talking about. Something that's quite familiar here in New South Wales, I think. I wonder, so you mentioned a number of user groups within the courtroom. So you mentioned the judiciary, you mentioned lawyers, the offenders, the public. I wonder if we thought, well, what's another important user group, let's say victims, and designed the courtroom for their experience, how that would change the outcomes. That's a lovely plan. In fact, the whole notion of users, I was, in that quote that I object to, they talk about users have been consulted. And of course, you first of all want to know, well, who do they mean by users? It's civil service unions, it's the Home Office, it's the probation service, it's prisoners, it's the Bar Council, it's the Law Society, it's judges, and you're thinking, and in a minute, because as a social scientist going into a project, you think about users, you think, let's go and interview some people in prison about the experiences that they had at the dock, which beautifully is what the Howard League for Penal Reform now wants to put in some funding to do in England with me, because they've got access to the prisoners. They've got good grounding there, so that would be interesting. But no, I think these are fascinating questions, and there are multiple voices, and there are conflict between those user groups that I think are excluded. But it would be interesting to run the project, wouldn't it, and see what they come up with. Yeah.
I've got a question just leading on from that about the relationship between the architect and the client. It really struck me in the examples that you use between the UK and Europe, and I suspect this, I don't know whether it's fact, that the procurement process itself is probably very different, which is what led to the outcome of very different looking buildings. So I imagine that the European buildings would have had much more comprehensive competition processes, which is really a process of challenging the brief. Right, whereas in the UK, the brief would have been given with the expectation of a limited challenge only. And it's the challenge of the brief that's where all the questions that you're asking for a judiciary that's challenging the conditions under which they're working, that's what the architect's role is with the brief.
Yeah.
So I think there's a whole lot of questions to be asked there about the conditions of procurement that lead to these buildings.
No, I think you're right. And a lot of the buildings that I've been talking about were built by government architects as part of the Property Services Agency. But there are references in the paper to the fact that they seem to experiment with different ideas. And what we're trying to find is that was there just this one experiment where they built a mock court in Teddington, got everyone to go and have a look at it, then rebuilt it, and then sort of said this is the template? Or were there other examples of, even within those constraints, of that very tight procurement process, very prescriptive procurement process and relationship between architect and client, were people still having a little bit of a play around? But what we've got to do is visit all the courts that were built during that era, because a lot of them won't have been changed in many significant ways. So there is a footprint there that we can still look at. And just to tease out those ideas, I mean, I don't want to assume that architects aren't subverting things on the ground, even though that they have a tightly prescribed
This is
structure.
why competitions are so fruitful in that sense, because all of the discarded competition entries are all where the entries have been too experimental. So they provide this incredibly interesting body of work, because you can see where architects are starting to really mess around with stuff in a way that is unacceptable. The diagram is unacceptable to the people that need to use it.
Well, I mean, one of the conversations that I think is quite interesting is who are, you know, if I think of examples of courthouses that I think are trying to subvert these conventions, I think of Richard Rogers. There's a Frank Lloyd Wright courthouse in California that was built, it was a round courthouse, round courtrooms. Of course, they're superstar architects. They have a different sort of
and neither
power.
of them are known for subverting conventions, actually. So I'm sure there's more around.
I've got two questions, and you just mentioned Frank Lloyd Wright. The first question I had, which was before I attended this lecture, was did your research consider the architect's esoteric or spiritual consciousness when they were designing court buildings, for example, light, geometric shapes, positioning of chairs, etc.? And I note that from looking at your lecture slides, we see that there's an evolutionary process. There's sort of like a cathedral-like courthouse moving towards a courthouse with specifications of the different counties. Some look like churches, some look, Gothic, etc. And my second question, and I'm thinking of people in Australia like the Burley Griffiths, and who had a very esoteric way of design, thought process with design, and in America, Frank Lloyd Wright, in the UK, possibly Christopher Wren, I'm thinking of Christopher Wren. And my second question is, have you seen a difference between the way in which the inquisitorial civil legal system creates its courthouses compared to the way our common law systems, the adversarial system, creates their courthouses?
I'll answer the second question first, if I can. When I was researching the architecture books that I produced, which took me 5 years, much was like a second PhD really, and it was as painful. People kept on saying to me, you know what you really want to look at? You want to do a comparative study of courts, or you know what you really ought to look at is tribunal. We've been talking about family courts as well. And actually, I just needed to do the 700 years of English history about one particular court and get that under my belt before I could go on. So no, haven't done that comparative study. I've seen quite a few courts in inquisitorial systems, but I think it's going to be the research projects after this one, and we've been talking to Courtstein about how we start doing some of that comparative work and perhaps get a discovery grant for it. So that's our goal, but it's sort of small steps because there are so many courthouses. In terms of your first question, I think my answer would be that as architectural projects, there are lots of stories about these buildings. And a lot of what I sort of got immersed in terms of 19th century design was the architect's ambition. I got obsessed with Alfred Waterhouse for a while because he was both interested in the Gothic but also internal planning. So he sort of began to marry the two interests that I had. But, you know, the Royal Courts of Justice in the Strand, I don't know whether you've been there.
Yes, I mean, this concept you have of due process. I mean, here in Australia, New South Wales, under our Civil Procedure Act, we have this concept of due process to due progress. I mean, what does that mean? And in England, you have the requisite Civil Procedure Act, which deals with justice, just the word justice, whereas we have what we call the just, the quick and the cheap, you know, which is pretty cheap. And we, you know, my colleague and I are writing an article on that at the moment. But when I spent some time in England and I was studying at a university in France, at law school there, the courthouses had paintings in them. They had paintings, they had decorative in the courthouses compared to the English courthouses. But there were some English courthouses which in the middle of the courthouses, they had this amazing ray of light coming down the middle of the courthouse, which where sometimes the light actually shone on the defendant or the applicant. Whereas, you know,
I wonder actually whether a more interesting project would not be inquisitorial and adversarial, but Protestant and Catholic countries, because I think it's about the fear of the image as well, isn't it?
Yes.
So yeah, I think that's that rich imagery of light commonly coming from behind the judge's head and the defendant coming up from the dark of hell and the cells beneath. Yeah, so you could also do it on religious, you know, orientation of a country, really. It's a good question.
Thanks very much for that fantastic talk. I'm kind of interested, I guess, in the relationship between law and art, perhaps, which was, I mean, I guess you kind of use art as an instrumental device at the beginning of the talk, talking about particular kinds of pre-Renaissance images, which are highly kind of symbolic in the way in which they start to describe, I guess, the purveyance of justice and all of the different kinds of personifications that need to be weighed. And in particular, I guess, things like the Italian Giotto-esque, kind of Lorenzetti, Sala della Pace, for example, which is, you know, the much more immersive mural that just literally is meant to be a constant reminder of what happens if you don't execute justice in a balanced and thoughtful way. I wonder if there is you've got a kind of call in this last image for architects and lawyers to kind of collaborate, but there didn't seem to be a kind of a conscious critique of the role for visual art, in particular kind of contemporary visual art, to also cast some kind of critical voice upon some of the spatial problematics that you've tried to kind of narrativize through the talk.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I'm slightly behind with my history of art project that I have with my architecture project, and I realised it was a slightly ambitious title that I gave a few months ago, and possibly I wouldn't have the space to do it all, but I think that's hopefully going to be one of the future projects. I mean, actually, when I was writing the book on architecture, I realised as a lawyer I needed to learn about architects, so I started to do methodology courses in architecture schools, and then I ended up doing a master's in history of art and architecture and realised that I was just as interested in the art as I was the architecture, so I'm sort of slowly moving there, but sort of feeling that I need to train myself up in those disciplines before I start going off and shouting. But some of the things that I think are really interesting about the use of artwork in courtrooms is, of course, I mean, I think this is being recorded, isn't it? But one of my original titles was Art as Law's Whore, which quite rightly some people objected to, so I didn't go there. But it is about that economy of permitted images, and with images, I'm very interested in images of justice sheer over time. I've written about one controversial image in Liverpool, which we only realised what the convention and code was around permitted images when those conventions start to get breached. And I think what is interesting is there are some really serious breaches recently. Judith Resnick does a lot in her wonderful Bible on the images of justice to draw attention to some of those subversive accounts. And she, you know, the South African Constitutional Court has artwork which tells us not just about the horror of apartheid, but the complicity of law in apartheid. And those are, I think, really interesting ways in which art and law are working together as to memorialise those abuses of law. I think the same happens in the Mexican Constitutional Court. I haven't seen that yet, but it has a lot of scenes showing the horror and how law was complicit in previous abuses of human rights. It's also an interesting one in Australia, I think, where you are seeing an awful lot more, am I right, Diane, sort of Aboriginal artwork coming into the courthouses as well. So, you know, there's another post-colonial story to be told there about the way you impose your artwork on what is probably quite an alien building that doesn't reflect the permitted relationships that you think are appropriate. So, yeah, I think there's an enormous project there, actually. Yeah.
If there's no more questions, I think we'll say thank you so much for such an interesting talk. And thank you, Emma, too, for organising. Thanks,
Yes,
Linda.
thanks, Linda.